Lesson 6, the growth of industry, the impact of trusts and corporations. I'm Mr. Ring.
And I'm Mr. Suter.
So, when we talk about trusts and corporations, we're talking about ways of companies organizing themselves. After the Civil War, the economic organization of companies tended to diversify. The idea that you start a company and that company becomes bigger within its current framework, becomes a model of the past. Companies start to consolidate different other companies into large scale organizational units. So for instance, let me give you an example, not a particularly good one, but let's take a steel industry. The steel industry could have or steel plant where you make steel, but technically start to incorporate other businesses that are necessary to the steel making process, either a mine, which provides them with the necessary raw materials, or the transportation system, which takes the raw materials to and from that steel plant. All of these types of businesses can get merged into what's known as a corporation. And by doing this, it reduced the manufacturing, the administrative costs you pay to other companies. It permits the coordination and specialization of a business activity, i.e., the fact that you can keep all of things in one house means that you can move things technically faster. You're not dependent on independent companies that might not be beholden to you. And it facilitates the accumulation of huge amounts of money because you're saving money on the actual, let's just say, day-to-day running of the business. You're not paying anybody else. Some industries, such as textiles and clothing, don't necessarily partake in this, much to their detriment. Yet, most other major types of corporations, or most other types of industries, rather, form corporations and achieve almost near monopoly status during these years. Corporations and then the trust, which we'll talk about later on, become dominant features of both the railroad industry, public utilities such as electricity, water, meat packing, tobacco, sugar refining, and whiskey.
So, the corporation tends to confuse people quite a lot. The key thing you need to know is, imagine a corporation as a bag of different companies. So, you may have started with a steel mill, and you have, in the process, as Sir said, picked up lots of different things. So, a corporation is what happens when you keep all those companies together. You allow those companies to keep existing. So the companies still existed, but they are run almost all together. So, for example, there is Company A, Company B, Company C, Company D. They all used to have their own bosses: Boss A, Boss B, Boss C, Boss D. But now we have Company A, Company B, Company C, and Company D, all run by Mr. Rain. Yeah, so they're almost a bag, which contains all these different companies. Don't worry too much about the specifics if you don't understand it. If you get stuck, it is a big collection of companies or one big company. Now, because of the very business-friendly rules in America, there were actually there was an advantage to being a corporation, and it gave you a lot of advantages perhaps over than simply being another company. So number one, you could choose to employ people who were skilled to run the corporation, and because you had loads and loads of different business and there's a lot more money floating around, you could pay them a lot more. So you've got high quality executives or CEOs who came in to run it, but the owners of the business would still own all the money of it. So almost you're paying someone to run the business while you relax on your estate. You get most of the profit. You might pay your CEO a lot of money though to reward them for doing working so well. The most important ones though are what are next on that bullet pointed list. Essentially, for a weird quirk of American law, corporations could act in some ways like they were a person or an entity. They could sue or be sued. So they could sue someone who had stolen their ideas, sue someone who was being anti-competitive, or sue someone to try and get them out of business and take them over. Technically, it's just a company. A company is just a thing on paper. Only people in theory could sue. But because of the very business-friendly rules, very, very business-friendly laws in America, made by politicians who are bribed and donated by businessmen, the corporations were given this power, and this is very important to give them more ability to get their stuff done, get their will done. Additionally, they could buy and sell property and own property as a person, which made it hard to take away, and also meant that if the owner died, the property would still belong to the sort of business, and therefore the son of the owner would be able to take it over and it won't be too much faff. It just belongs, it allows continuity. As well as that, if you have a corporation and you have lots of different businesses, you are more efficient. So what do I mean by that? If you've got a railway industry, you have to pay a man who runs the coal mines. You have to pay for new steel works, so for steel to run on your rails. If, however, you own the coal mine, you can charge yourself. You dig the coal. You don't have to charge yourself a profit. Your coal will be cheaper. If I'm buying my coal from Mr. Rain, he's going to charge extra so he can make a profit. If I'm charging myself, I'm not going to charge profit. I can make it cheaper, which makes my goods cheaper. As well as that, because corporations were often bigger and they had monopoly and they had a lot of profit, they also attract a lot more investors, which then get more money into the company through shareholding and lending. And a very important thing to realize about corporations is they have all these rights and they have almost this power because they're so big, but there's very few government rules about what they should or should not do. They don't have to record anything about what they did and who they're paying and who their dividends, that's the money from the company, are going to. And therefore, it allows you in secret to get away with quite a lot without anyone prying. And therefore, if you are thinking from a perspective of what is the best way to grow, a corporation provides the scale, so you can sell more stuff, the integration, the vertical integration, which means you can get all the raw materials far cheaper because no one is charging a profit, and the laws and the rules, which means you can do what helps you and also you don't have to do what doesn't help you, which then benefit growth.
Now, the next component is a natural, let's say, flow from the corporation. So once you have a handle of what a corporation is, the next thing you have to understand is that most corporations form what they call trusts. And this is the part when I look across the classroom and I see students' heads exploding. What the heck is a trust? I'm going to try to break this down very simply. And this is a point when you might want to make a few notes, that Mr. Rain sort of verbally gives you a flow chart. You have the United States. It is formed of a combination of independent states coming together to make a country. In the US system, the states are more powerful than the federal government. That means if I am one state, so let's take Massachusetts, and Mr. Suter is another state, let's call it New York, I am free to pass laws in New York or in Massachusetts that allow me to bar or create a barrier to things being made in New York entering Massachusetts. And as a result of the power which states have, there's very little the federal government can do for it. In the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, big businesses formed into corporations found it difficult to sell to the nationwide market. Mostly because, and I'll give you a really good example, Standard Oil wants to sell its refined oil to Louisiana. Louisiana has its own oil refining companies. So the state of Louisiana, wanting to protect its own individuals, would say something like, we will not allow, or we will put a huge tax on any foreign, i.e. out-of-state oil sold in Louisiana. Now, that means Standard Oil is uncompetitive and cannot profit from the good people of Louisiana. The trust is a way around those interstate barriers. Okay? Now, the first thing they come up with is the idea of a pool. Okay? And this is an informal agreement between firms to limit outputs or to divide up markets. So, for instance, Louisiana Oil Company and Ohio-based Standard Oil would meet and they'd say, okay, fine. Yes, you can't sell in Louisiana and I can't sell in Ohio, but why don't we just split America in two and you take that and I'll take that. We'll call it a pool. I'll have this pool, you have that pool, everyone will be happy. The problem with that is these things weren't legally binding and it took, only a very short period of time before the person who made those types of agreements to sort of go against them. And by the 1880s, no one would organize themselves into a pool because these people are so ruthless and so greedy that they're not willing to work with each other on an even playing field. Now, how to get around both state laws and the idea that a lot of people don't live up to the commitments they made when they made a pool is the fact that it is the creation of the trust. And the trust is the unique genius of one individual working with Standard Oil. His name is Henry Flagler. And Henry Flagler is the secretary of Standard Oil. He's got a very high up job. He's in charge of administration. And not only that, all of the finances of the company come through him. he comes up with a loophole in the law, where he can appoint himself as a trustee. So, in other words, if Company A, Standard Oil of Ohio, wants to now sell its oil in Louisiana, it can create its own company, independent of Standard Oil, and as long as that company is not owned and in name by John D. Rockefeller, the owner of Standard Oil, and is put in trust, i.e., in Henry Flagler's permission, Henry Flagler is legally allowed to buy Standard Oil, sell Standard Oil, because that oil is essentially decoupled from the corporation. So what happens is Flagler and two other individuals in Standard Oil become trustees of properties and assets owned by Standard Oil outside of the state. So in essence, by law, Standard Oil does not necessarily own it. And if it owns it, it's put in trust, i.e., I'm trusting this person to look after it. I have no say over the running of that company and the business practices of that company. Legally, that's what the trust was. In reality, it's a simple way to get around law. It also meant that Standard Oil ends up controlling huge areas of entire industries. And it also means that the sort of founding of monopolies or cartels, these one companies that control all aspects of business, becomes prevalent in the late 19th century. Now, just to reiterate, if you are a trustee and you're in charge of a company's business, you can't technically take orders from that company. There can't be a paper trail. However, you can meet with John D. Rockefeller. You can sit in his library or his study. You can have a coffee with the man, and you can talk about what he wants you to do. If you decide to do that on your own time, that's good. In reality, trusts are just shells. These people are following the orders of the large corporations and the robber barons who run them. However, they're circumventing the law because they're putting a name of another individual instead of John D. Rockefeller or Cornelius Vanderbilt or whomever on that company. And as a result, that company is a trust. It's part of Standard Oil, but it's separated from. All this means is that these companies find a way to get around state laws instead of huge monopolies, so much so that they control huge sections of the business.
So what is the impact of the trusts? The first major trust, and the one you use for your specific example, is in 1882, Standard Oil, Rockefeller's domination of the market, should we say, of Ohio created the first trust. And what, as mentioned, this meant was the stockholders, the people who owned, who very often were the same people and close to or employees of Rockefeller, who owned 77 different oil companies, all in different states. So if it joined up, it would be illegal or hit the tariffs, internal tariffs and tolls, customs, sorry, not tariffs, and tolls within a state, producing 90% of the country's oil, all gave the right to control the stock to 9 trustees. These 9 trustees were obviously people who in turn were employed or owed significantly allegiance to Rockefeller.
But were legally independent of.
Yeah, their role as a trustee was separate of anything they happened to do with Rockefeller, officially. Wink. Obviously, Ohio doesn't like this goes against it, and the state court begins trying to dismantle it and challenges it. It gets challenged in the court. Before that gets resolved, though, Standard Oil goes to New Jersey, which are more than willing to both take the bribes which come along with a Rockefeller operation, and were known for having slightly less regulation and slightly more controlled by manufacturers in that period.
So, still, actually, New Jersey is known as a state of deregulation. It's only one of 2 states in the United States to this day, for instance, where gambling is legal.
And also, it's deeply corrupt as a state today.
We've all seen The Sopranos, at least I have.
Yeah. So the trust evolves by the mid-1890s, become more formalized. Essentially, this idea becomes more organized, and they realize they start accountants across America start learning ways to take the mick and almost make it hit the most efficient way to use this loophole, as it was, into the most organized system, and it becomes a holding company. And essentially what you have is a series of stocks owned by stocks, owned by stocks, owned by stocks. You don't have to know all the details. But essentially, at the end of this, there is a company who has responsibility over all these trustees and all their stocks. And that happens to be owned by the owner, in this case, Rockefeller for oil. So basically, all we can say is it has become more systematized, more organized, and more easy to run, shall we say. Um, the Sugar Refining Trust in 1891 was the first one to do this, and the statistics are there. I don't need to read them out for you, but basically, it means that you can control your industry hugely.
Okay, so what are the positives of corporations? Well, obviously, if you're a robber baron, there are many. Number one, it's allowed. The legal system in the United States has loopholes you can drive a lorry through. As a result, member companies of a trust are legally separate entities, but the management is done overall by the trust in conjunction with the overall owner of that company. This way, everything is centrally controlled while having the legal appearance of being different and independent. Government lets this continue. They don't step in and say, guys, this is out of control. I mean, you guys are taking the mix, so to speak, but they do it because they believe in what's known as laissez-faire, the idea that government will keep its hands off. And because mostly Republicans dominate Congress. Therefore, Republicans, always the company of big business northerners, dominate Congress throughout the Gilded Age. Only towards the turn of the century did the Democrats come in with a more big government, a government policy that's sort of anti-laissez-faire. But throughout this time, they could basically big business with the Republican Party in its pocket can do whatever it wants. Reason number two is obviously economic. It allows for integration of production, whether horizontally or vertically. The idea you can own all of the companies in one particular industry is horizontal integration. Vertical integration is you can not only own the companies in your field of business, i.e. oil, you can own all of the companies that supply your field of business, the trains that transport it, the mines that produce the coal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As a result, these companies become way more efficient when a company is more efficient and can get things from with removing the middleman and paying and remove the ability of paying others. You can make profits that were previously unforeseen, and these companies become mega corporations of phenomenal wealth. Additionally, you can corner the market. A trust can accumulate as much and as enough of all of the market as it possibly can get its hold on. So you saw the example of Standard Oil owning over 90% of the oil market in the United States. And Standard Oil is still a huge player in the United States, although the sort of Standard Oil got a bad name. So now if you go to, like, let's say an Esso gas station, for instance, you're buying the gas of Standard Oil.
I did not know that.
Yeah, that's the last two initials in Esso are Standard Oil.
I learned something from you. Wow.
Yeah, there you go.
It makes so much. What's the ES then?
Eastern something Standard Oil.
Okay.
Yeah, Eastern Standard Oil. A couple other examples. Exxon is also a Standard Oil company. Yeah, it's just to name a few. Anyways, make a long story short. Profit. Once you control the market, you can regulate prices. Okay, if you're the only one supplying oil, more or less, the idea of competition driving down prices and another guy coming onto the market and selling their oil cheaper is basically gone because you own it all. So you can always ensure that people are paying top dollar for your goods. And if you have something like oil that everybody naturally needs, you stand to make a fortune. Anyhow, that's why trusts are positive.
So, what are our examples we use in the exam? Obviously, Standard Oil with Rockefeller in charge, we've mentioned, but also the US Steel Trust with Carnegie. He's particularly interesting, actually, because he not only used the fact that he owned the railroads and he owned the production of coke, which is essential to make steel, which is sort of off thing of coal production, essentially. He doesn't just use that to make himself and his company cheaper. So by making a deal with a coal manufacturer so that your coal is cheaper and taking over coal as time went on, he actually used it to ensure that his railroads and his coal manufacturers would not give this give the use of their railroads and give their coal to their competitors, meaning their competitors either couldn't compete because they couldn't move their stuff they need on the railroads, or had to pay a lot more from other people to get that coal. So not only do they use it to help themselves, they use it to sort of screw over their competition who eventually have to give up and join, usually reluctantly, the US Steel Trust. There are other trusts as well, copper, tobacco, sugar, but you don't need to go through all the details of all of them in order to understand them.
Okay, so what are the reactions to the trust? What are the negatives of the trust? Now, I just want you to think about this, and maybe you'll realize that you can come back to this particular lesson a little bit later on. This unit is titled "The Gilded Age and the Progressive Movement." The progressive movement is something that comes as a as a result of, rather, the Gilded Age, the excesses of the Gilded Age. The progressives are a group of journalists, a group of politicians who believe that the people of the Gilded Age have essentially taken the mick, that Americans have been left behind and hurt by the sort of laissez-faire policies of the Republicans, the actions of the robber barons, the trust in the corporation, etc. Now, many Americans begin to truly despise the power of the trust. Okay, there are lots of reasons for it, and this will become a political movement. So you may want to argue later on that the reaction to trust in corporations and big business was one of the reasons for the progressive movement, and you may want to revisit this, but let me sort of bring you through it. Americans hate it. The rank and file American, if you were to pull them over in the street in 1885 and you ask them what they thought about the power of corporations and the trust, would be negative about it. They saw them as un-American. The whole concept of the American dream is you can come to America, you can work hard, you can have what you want, you can make a business, and that business can succeed if you do it right and you work hard enough. Trusts undermine that. The ability for one industry to corner a market means nobody can come in. You can't compete against Standard Oil because they will crush you. Okay, they can absorb losses. So you lower your price, they'll lower it against you. Moreover, they'll just probably, I don't know, they'll take you out, put it that way. As a result of this, most Americans come to hate and resent the fact that the corporation and the trust are ruining the American dream. Secondly, journalists, and this is a highly literate society, a highly educated society by comparison, so people are reading, start to take action against the corporation or the trust. And these journalists are known as the muckrakers because they sort of dig out the dirt, if you will. People like Henry George, Edward Bellamy, Henry Demar Lloyd. These guys are writing articles in national newspapers and magazines to expose the corruption and the unfair practices of the trust. One of the best examples that show that the trust is truly maligned and hated across the wide the breadth of American society is one of my favorite examples, known as the beef trust example. So in Chicago, there is a trust in the that has basically come to control almost all of the beef industry in the United States. One of the beef trust members, one of the leading sort of robber barons in the beef industry, is actually kidnapped, okay, by an angry worker. Okay, he's kidnapped for several weeks. He's caught. He doesn't kill the man. The man goes back to his gilded mansion, etc., etc. This man is put on trial for kidnapping, which is an incredibly serious crime, and in the United States is punishable by death. In his trial, the jury of his peers, acquits him because he had a right to be angry at the corruption of the owner of the beef trust. And as this man gets kidnapped, other man who doesn't gets off because people are just so sick of the trust. So this sort of growing unpopularity, as evidenced by the example I just put, have a lot of groups start to feel that big corporations are threatening very democracy and the institutions in which they hold dear. They see the decline of competition meant an end to the economic opportunity and the individual mobility that the American dream is based on. Thorstein Veblen's savage assault on businessmen and their pecuniary values, the sort of concept that these businessmen operate almost outside of the law. Veblen is a famous turn-of-the-century American dramatist and novelist who writes a lot of books that have a satirical nature, which attack the nature of which attack trust and so on and so forth.
So what's our overall analysis then? So the answer is it depends who you are. If you are someone who had already had a large corporation or a large company, about 1860 onwards, then trusts are exceedingly brilliant because they give you a legal means to only grow and become a greater monopoly and have greater power. And so trusts, as a means to enrich an individual, to make them evade any semblance of the loose regulation and law that there is around businesses, is fantastic. It's 100% A-OK, and that's why everyone does it. You can argue in a very sympathetic, and this was the argument that robber barons / captains of industry said, and some right-wing commentators today still cling to, is that trusts, by being so big and being so profitable, it gave them a global advantage. What I meant is they could afford to take risks and send steel cheaper to Britain or France or Belgium. I don't know why I said Belgium there, but anyway. So Belgium.
So we all know the Belgians are known as the chief consumers of steel in Europe.
And if it doesn't go well, or if there's like a downturn, they make a loss. They sell all the stuff and they don't quite make their money back. It's not the end of the world because they make so much money internally from the monopoly they have. So it means that they're an export, and what that means is in turn that British steel manufacturers go out of business because the Americans are out competing them, and then it means that there's no one sending steel back into America, which means you make more money in America, but also means you have less competition in Britain, which then means you make more profit because there's less competition. So actually, it destroys foreign markets, and you can eat that for a bit, like Starbucks does. Starbucks goes into a town and it sells its coffee cheaper, and it basically just makes a loss rate until all the other coffee shops are out of business, and then it starts to be able to make a profit. Anyway, on the other hand, though, you can argue it has serious implications for the rest of the economy. By having such a large organization, you will almost automatically have a monopoly. And if you have a monopoly, then obviously you are not going to let any competition emerge. So say, for example, if someone strikes oil up in Ohio in a bit of land not owned by Rockefeller, he will make sure that you are not allowed to use any of the refineries that he owns, any of the railways that he uses, and that no one who buys oil will buy oil from you, because otherwise Rockefeller will say, no, he's not going to sell oil to you. And therefore you go out of business, or you are forced to sell your competition, your small oil well, to Rockefeller at a loss. Okay, so with that dominance, arguably the competition is reduced. As well as that, if there's only one person giving jobs in the steel industry, you ain't got much choice of who you're going to work for if you're a steel worker. And therefore, in reality, it's difficult for you to fight for paying conditions, because say if you go on strike in the steel mill in Pennsylvania, the steel mill in Massachusetts will carry on working, and they may even send workers down to work there. So essentially, because the businesses were big, they could fight the strikes, they could pay for strike breakers, they could pay for the Pinkertons to come down and shoot you back to work, but also they were allowed to divide and rule between all the workers across the US, and it's very difficult to get an entirely national strike going on. As well as that, if you have a monopoly, you keep prices higher. No one can compete you outwards. And finally, you can argue that having such powerful and rich men that is caused by the trusts means that politics becomes even more corrupted and base, because now you have very rich and important men who are very keen to keep their position. And the fact that everyone hates this means that you've got to do a lot of bribing to make sure the government doesn't listen to their voters and change you or challenge you. So in reality, it is a very big conflict of interest, and you can argue a lot of the cynicism and hatred towards democracy in this period is driven by the fact that people see everyone voting to get rid of trusts or voting against trusts, and the politicians in Washington being corrupted by money and not doing anything. It makes politics look dirty, it makes it look corrupt, and you need someone to go out and drain the swamp.
Okay, so the government does get involved, and this is something we're going to talk about a little bit later in other lessons. But just a quick overview now of some of the big things that come up in the late 19th century as a form of government response to the trust. Firstly, you need to point out that both of these acts happened under the Republicans. The Democrats are much keener than the Republicans on what's known as antitrust legislation, sort of working against these large trusts and corporations. Nevertheless, the Republicans do two things. Number one, they set up the Interstate Commerce Act. Basically, it says that all railroads and all railroad charges should be reasonable and just. It prevents railroad trusts and corporations from levying humongous tariffs or humongous charges against companies that might be in competition with something they are. So basically, they prevent railroads from charging excessive amounts for people to ship or travel on the railroads. And they set up a commission to supervise the affairs of railroads to sort of keep it in check. Railroad companies are forced to publish their rates. They'd often had secret rates. So for instance, big business could get a cheaper rates, and they would overcharge smaller ones to knock them out of the market. Overall, the Interstate Commerce Act and the Commission itself aren't necessarily that effective, as they couldn't set rates. So yes, the railroad companies would publish their rates, they would just publish high ones, and people would always pay high rates. So prices actually don't go down in the railroads, which makes it harder, of course, for a small company to compete, because a larger corporation can, in fact, absorb more cost. The biggest one, and something you'll talk about, is something known as the Sherman Antitrust Act, and you must know what this is. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 basically says that any trust that restricts the trade between states or between foreign nations was illegal, i.e., that trusts could not prevent smaller companies from getting into a state in which they dominate the market from. The language, however, of this act is quite vague. As a result, corporations, which are able to hire incredibly expensive lawyers, some of the best people in the business, attack it and bring the cases against the Sherman Antitrust Act to the Supreme Court. As a rule, the Supreme Court, which can only uphold the law as it's written, and it should be blind in this respect, and in effect is, however, they're hamstrung by the fact that the law says what it says, and they can only do so far, is forced to rule in the United States versus E.C. Knight that the American Sugar Refining Company had not violated the Sherman Antitrust Act by taking over a number of competitors, even though it controlled 98% of the sugar refining market in the United States. Effectively, they were saying that by doing this, they were not, in fact, hindering trade because refining and manufacturing is not trade. Even though after you've refined it or manufactured it, you send it across states. The actual refining and manufacturing isn't. So if you buy the refining and manufacturing, you're not actually engaged in trade. It seems stupid, but if according to the letter of the law, that is the way the court defined it. And as such, between 1890 and 1901, federal law officers only initiate 18 suits under the Sherman Antitrust Act and win merely 10 of them. So basically, things continue on almost unfettered through the end of the late 19th century.
As time goes on, the democratic governments in particular start taking more of a challenge against them, partly because they rise up populist rage, partly because they have always been ideologically against, or at least more against, trusts. Essentially, the two things they do, they set up the Federal Trade Commission, which is a government organization with slightly more powers to see when business transactions, particularly when one company takes over another company or makes a deal with another company, that they conform to the law. Before that, there's nobody keeping an eye on these deals. So you could be, although technically it was legal, if there's no policeman, shall we say, to catch you, then it's fine. And so the Federal Trade Commission is a policeman for a lot of the rules which are stopping trusts to operate. As well as that, there's a Clayton Act, which filled in the gap around the Sherman Antitrust Act, for example, saying that in terms of the sugar refining stuff, you couldn't set prices, you couldn't merge, and you couldn't acquire new things, and all the other sort of ways and loopholes that trusts used to try and say that they weren't trusts or to maintain control, which were in ways which weren't covered by the Sherman Act. One thing to note, though, what is key to understanding the government response or lack thereof is the government, even if it has the power to do something or the law to do something, doesn't necessarily mean it will go and do something. Okay, it needs the will. It needs the want to enforce antitrust. It needs the want to tell its Federal Trade Commission to go and hunt down trusts and take them down. You could just as easily have a Federal Trade Commission which doesn't do anything if the president doesn't want them to. So you could argue part of the change under democratic government in the 1900s was that they increasingly wanted to enforce these laws. A Sherman Act with someone who doesn't want to enforce it is useless.
So that's all we have for trusts and corporations today. Of course, if your mind is sufficiently blown and your head has come off its swivel, please do ask us questions in class because we can help you explain it further, perhaps by providing a chart and or a diagram. But anyways, that's all I have to say.